So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Rojas, and he will give his presentations and leave a little bit of time at the end of each presentation. The questions will be fielded through the chat. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Rojas. We're honored to have him present as our keynote speaker.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to this today. Thank you so much for a really nice introduction. I appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone at Seattle Children's for this opportunity. As Kathy mentioned, I'm currently at UT Dallas. Previous to that, I've lived in different parts of the country. I work with kids in Chicago and Philadelphia, here in Texas. And this is an area of both research and clinical practice that yes, I think it's really important. It's also very exciting to me. So I'm glad that we're getting to focus on this today. And yes, I'm going to try to leave a little bit of time at the end of each of my talks today for questions. However, I might be asking people questions as I talk as well. So if I end up doing that, I do have my chat window open and I'll be able to hopefully monitor that. All right. I guess I'll do a quick sound check. Can people hear me? I guess someone would have told me something by now if people couldn't hear me. So I think we're okay on that end.
Yes, you sound good, Dr. Rojas.
Okay. All right, perfect. Just making sure. Just quick disclosures. As we were saying, I work at UT Dallas. I'm getting compensation for doing today's keynote and talk. And I also have a non-financial relationship with Salt Software as I developed the capability to analyze language samples in Spanish, but I don't get paid any money for it. So, and just some acknowledgments. I have collaborators in different parts of the country. I obviously want to definitely always acknowledge everyone who has been, who currently is part of my lab. And without a doubt, all the children and families and teachers and administrators and everyone who has allowed us to conduct research with this population. And finally, support from various institutions and foundations and some anonymous donors for some of the work that we do in my lab. Okay, hit the wrong button. Okay, so was being said in the intro, the purpose of this first talk or the keynote is to really kind of provide a pretty broad overview, but also focus on what I feel are concepts, background, and definitions that I think are critical when we want to sort of put into context what's required to provide the most appropriate clinical services to bilingual populations. So here's an overview of some of the things that I will talk about today. As I talk today, I'm conscious that we have some of our audience members are not necessarily all from the United States, even though I think the majority are, but we do have some audience members from different parts of the world, which I think is terribly exciting. One of the things that you'll notice in my talk today is I'm going to be pretty focused on bilingualism, and I know in other parts of the world it's really more about multilingualism. I'm not going to touch on that as much today. But I think a lot of this information still applies. So with that sort of disclaimer out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so starting with labels, right? We always use labels to talk about sometimes different populations or different skill sets. So when we talk about children who speak two languages or learn two languages, sometimes we call them bilingual, sometimes we call them dual language learners, sometimes we call them English learners. And I'll talk a little bit about some of these, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. The idea is that we're really talking about individuals who are in the process of acquiring and developing two languages, right? Whether that is simultaneously or sequentially. In terms of looking at both children and adults, folks who report speaking languages other than English at home, it's quite a large number of the US population, as you can see here. It's almost a quarter of the US population, and that segment of the population actually keeps on expanding, which is something that I'll switch on today, right? Which is first, kind of putting things into context, right? So one of the things that I will focus on today when we talk about dual language learners is you'll see me talk quite a lot about Spanish English. And of course, there's a lot of other language combinations. Part of the reason I'm focusing on these kids is one, it's the largest population of DLLs in this country, but also not just because it's big, but because it's a population that tends to be of concern for different reasons, right? However, there's not just Spanish speaking, right? We can see here's a table from a chapter I recently co-published. What we did is we kind of compared some prior demographics and some projected demographics to 2060, right? And you can see here this is the way that the U.S. Census kind of breaks down populations by origin. And I think one of the things that's really clear is the changes from quote unquote 2014 to 2060, right? So if we think about like 40 years from now, what's going to be happening, right? And I think some patterns here seem to be really clear, right? I think one is that both the Hispanic and the Asian American population are projected to nearly double, right? And those under 18, that increase is even more pronounced. And when we think about children, we're talking about kids that are 18 and under, right? So this is these two populations I feel we need to really keep our eye on. Most of when we talk about our evidence base for our discipline of communication disorders, both theoretical frameworks and empirical evidence, the majority of it is really based on monolingual English-speaking children, right? The evidence base on dual language learners, I feel, is an area that's extremely exciting. It's emerging, it's growing. I think you're starting to see more and more evidence coming out in terms of people who are doing research on these kids, and I think it's a very exciting time. I do some of this work, and I have other colleagues who do this work, and I think it's just a great time to be both a clinician and to be a clinical researcher in this area. Now, the next part I want to switch to is to talk about demographics, because I think sometimes we might get pretty kind of focused on kind of where we work and who we work with, and some of the demographic changes for some of us are very clear, and for some of us they might not be as clear, right? So I'll talk about some of these things, and I think it's going to be and hopefully impactful, depending on how closely or not closely you follow this, in terms of why it's important to kind of have an idea of what's happening demographically, at least in the United States, right? Of course, this first piece that I'm showing you here, I think, was widely publicized in popular media, right? Which is our latest U.S. Census. They come out every decade, every 10 years. It was the first time in history that the quote unquote white alone population actually demonstrated a decrease, right? An overall decrease in that 10-year period. And the largest minority population, this already occurred in 2010, and 2020 is still the case, are Hispanics. And it's about 18.7% of the total population. I have it in asterisk because that projection by around 2050 is supposed to be about 30% of the population. And in terms of kids who are 5 and under, for those of us who might work with very young children, currently that's almost 30% of the total population 5 and under, right? But I still think this deserves a closer look, right? So let's kind of look, especially a look over time. So this is directly from the US Census website. This shows you this kind of overall decrease, right? Around the country from 2010 to 2020. And in this map, anything that, kind of is more kind of, I don't know what you would call it, light violet, I don't know what you would call it. That's where you have the greatest increase, and the darker green are the largest decreases, right, in the white alone population. So even though we're meeting virtually, we're being hosted by Seattle Children. So I wanted to do a little closer look into the state of Washington, which is where Seattle Children's is located. And in Washington, that percentage decrease in the violent population was about 1.3% decrease, right, which is a lot less than countrywide. But let's look at the percentage change in the Hispanic or the Latino or the Latinx population, right, over that 10-year period. So across the country, it was a 23% increase, right? Anything that's kind of darker, again, purple, violet, means it's a much larger change. And let's see what's happening again in the state of Washington. So even though in the state of Washington, the percentage decrease in the violent population was less than the national average, in terms of the percentage increase in the Hispanic or Latinx population, relative to the national average of 23%. In Washington, it was 40%, right? So that's a pretty large increase in a 10-year period, and it's projected to keep on increasing. Now, to kind of, this is kind of the final piece on demographics by origin, but I thought it would be interesting to look at kind of this kind of dynamic change, right? So one is, you can focus on the US, which kind of talked about again, but I kind of want to, again, focus on Washington, right? So this is a little screen recording. You're going to see this little thing change from 2010 to 2020. And this I had already reported, right? These changes, which was the white alone population decreased from 72.5% to 63%. And then the second largest ethnic group, which is Hispanic or Latinx in Washington, increased from 11.2 to 13.7%. But then the third largest ethnic group happens to be Asian alone in Washington, and that increased from 7.1% to 9.4%, right? So, we can't always wait another 10 years to figure out what's happening demographically in the country, but I do think, especially now that that data from this current census just started coming out, I think it's a perfect time to kind of revisit some of these issues. Now, today I'll primarily talk about these kids, and I'll refer to them as dual language learners because it's really kind of the widest sort of category right now. Within that category, especially if we think about school-age children, many times we're often referring to children who are quote unquote designated as English learners. You may have also heard them referred to as English language learners. It's the same idea. This is really a definition that comes from the Department of Education, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's look around the country. This is the latest data from the National Center for Education Statistics. So the average proportion of students in public schools who are designated as English learners is 10.2% around the country. Where I work, anything that's dark green, that means it's 10% or higher. I work at the state level in Texas, it's 18.7%. In the city that I work in Dallas, it's actually about 52%. If we look in Washington, it's also in that dark green category, right? It's more than 10% of the students in public schools in the state of Washington are designated as English learners. And so now let's talk about these kids a little bit. I just think it deserves a little bit of attention, right? Because dual language learners and English learners, again, this is the issue of labels. Are they the same thing? Technically, no. You can have dual language learners who are not designated as English learners, and you can have some dual language learners who are designated as English learners. And that really depends on what happens to kids whose parents report that they speak languages. They might speak English, but they might speak other languages at home that are not English. And whenever that happens in a public school, kids will get tested for language proficiency upon enrollment. And when that happens, is the school will determine, okay, this family reported that they speak Spanish, or they speak Gujarati, or they speak Cantonese. So we're going to test the kid for proficiency. And if a kid gets a score over X, the kid's not going to be an English learner, and below X, the kid's going to be an English learner. And really that gets reported then to the state, and it also gets reported to the Department of Education. And essentially, the school district is saying this particular child has insufficient skills in English to really demonstrate academic achievement if this child were to be taught only in English, right? So this kid will probably need some degree of programming in terms of quote unquote, like maybe bilingual instruction or structured English immersion or some kind of instructional program. Around the country, just in general, about a third of school-age kids, I would say like elementary-age kids, speak Spanish at home, and they also report speaking English with some difficulty. That percentage increases when you break it down by essentially socioeconomic status. So it goes up a little bit. And again, the latest data, we already saw this on the map, right? It's about 10% of kids in public schools are ELs. The majority of ELs in the United States happen to speak Spanish, and they happen to be Hispanic, right? We have ELs who also speak other languages that are not Spanish, but the majority do speak Spanish. Now, another thing to kind of keep in mind is what is the typical educational environment of English learners? The vast majority of them are concentrated in larger urban areas, and so they go to these quote unquote urbanized school districts. They tend to be predominantly from low income, racial, ethnic minority populations, primarily being Hispanic. And these kids tend to attend public schools that are both racially and socioeconomically, they tend to be just more segregated, and they tend to live in neighborhoods that are more segregated. And that there's a whole history of why that's the case, which we don't have time to get into today. But some of you probably have ideas as to why that is the case. This is something I think is really important to kind of to show folks, right? So we know that having a disadvantage in socioeconomic status can have all sorts of risk factors, right? Which doesn't guarantee anything, but it has an impact, right? And what you see here, what I have kind of this breakdown is kids in public schools who are designated as English learners and kids who are not designated as English learners, right? You see some pretty large differences, right? A big difference here is how many parents have less than high school education, a lot more here, a lot less here, right? Parent with a post-secondary degree, a lot more here, a lot less here. Obviously, a big one is your median family income. Big difference, right? Almost double the income for non-ELs. And then kids who are experiencing low income, it's a really high percentage here, not as high here. The one thing that I think is really important here is this, right? Which is sometimes there can be assumptions made that maybe this is because parents don't want to work. And that's not really the case, right? You do have parents who are working year round, and that difference is pretty comparable, right? So the majority have parents that are working full time, but yet the median family income is a lot lower. And if we think about kids who are designated as English learners, you have to then kind of think, well, at home, that means the kids are speaking a language other than English, and maybe English is also being spoken. But it's likely that some of these differences in earning power might have to do with the parents' ability to, or lack of ability, or education, right, in English, which sometimes can really affect your earning power, at least in the United States. Another part that I think is really important for us to kind of keep in mind is there's this just tendency to misdiagnose kids, right? About 30 to 50% more likely than non-ELs to be diagnosed with different kinds of disabilities, but especially language learning disabilities. And another reason why this population is of concern is because of an academic achievement gap that has been documented for many years and does not seem to be improving. There has been some improvement. I shouldn't say that. There has been some improvement, but not nearly enough as we would like to see, right? This little table here, this is a national reading test. And this is the proportion of kids who basically just pass the test. This is not just like good reading. This is like barely passable reading for your age level, right? So kids are at or above basic. If we look at kids in fourth grade, about 66% of non-ELs. So you could say this is concerning too, right? There's a lot of kids who are not at that level. But more than half are, but ELs, it's about 35%. And then when we look at 8th graders, this proportion goes up, which is good. That's what we want to see. But this proportion actually gets smaller, which is not good, right? So this is kind of one of these things where it's like, we really need to focus on these kids, right? So what's the expectation that we have for English learners, right? So I've done a little bit of work on this area. And I think it's really important for us to think about, as clinicians, but also those of us who might work along with teachers or other educators, which is really the expectation is we want English learners to essentially demonstrate academic achievement extremely fast. We want them to do it as quickly as possible. We want them to do it in a language that for many of these kids is their second language, right? So what the ELs need to do, right? And we've kind of done a lot of crunching of numbers with thousands of kids, which is these kids need to demonstrate a growth rate in their English acquisition that's 1.5 times faster than that of monolingual English-speaking kids, right? So basically, these kids need to acquire English, and they need to acquire it really quickly in order to quote unquote catch up, right? And ELs do this, right? They do exhibit aggressive English growth, but they don't all do, right? This is kind of like an average level. And there's a lot of factors to kind of consider, right? I think one of the biggest things is this expectation and this sort of estimation of how quickly they need to grow. That's based on kids who are typically developing. That's not even based on kids who have potentially any kind of developmental impairments, whether it's language or other impairments. So it's just something I think
Dr. Rojas?
important. Yes.
We have a question that's come in. Do we know if these numbers, 30 to 50%, are consistent across states?
Those numbers, they're probably talking about this. Oh, are they consistent across states? That's a really good question. That range is really kind of reported from different parts of the literature, not necessarily about a particular state. I would say that those numbers are and this is not based on evidence, but this is based on my professional experience working in different public school districts as a speech pathologist. I feel like that can be heavily dependent also on the specific district where you work in. Some districts are very up to date with the evidence base, and some districts are not. When I worked as a bilingual speech pathologist, I was actually hired in a district that was sued by the Office of Civil Rights because it was about 92% Hispanic, and they didn't have one bilingual SLP, so they got sued. And then they had to hire bilingual SLP. So I think those numbers is something we need to sort of be aware of. And is it consistent across states? I would say it's probably going to vary quite a bit, but I think the variability is really going to be from district to district. I hope that helps a little bit with the question. I'm gonna keep moving, but really good question. So to kind of wrap up the demographics piece, I mean, we just basically need to be ready, right? We need to be ready to serve clients from different backgrounds, both linguistic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. But I think the really important part is if you're not already having to serve bilingual speakers, you probably will at some point in your career. I mean, there might be a way for you to avoid it, but it's going to be really hard. It's going to be hard like for the rest of your career. I think you're going to have to do it. And because of that, you do want to consider both languages when you make clinical decisions, and we'll talk more about that today. Finally, I think it's important to get a picture of our particular discipline, the American Speech Language Hearing Association. They conduct these annual membership surveys. The latest survey, which is really from 2020, but it was published this year. This is the number of clinical providers. This is including both speech language pathologists, audiologists, folks with dual certification. In terms of quote unquote bilingual providers, and I'll talk about what that means later, these are folks who self-identify as being bilingual providers. Out of that 207,000, about 8% report to be bilingual providers. And the majority of that 8% happen to be Spanish speaking. So 92% of clinical providers in this country do not identify as bilingual providers. So This is more in terms of thinking of ourselves and recruiting students, and I work in the field of education, so this is something I'm very aware of. And I was very aware of this also when I worked full-time as a speech language pathologist, right? That there's definitely a need, really, there's a desperate need for more clinical providers who have hopefully the skill set, both in terms of clinical content, but in terms of language and literacy to work with bilingual individuals. All right, so demographics out of the way, let's go ahead and shift to thinking about concepts of linguistic diversity, right? So we see this across within monolingual populations and obviously within dual language learners, right? You know, in terms of monolingual speakers, we see it in terms of different dialectal variations that are spoken, right? And I have some examples here from the US. Of course, we see it different languages or different languages. And that variation of dialectal variation is really a fundamental source that we need to always consider, right? So real basic info, most of you are already aware of this. Do you know resources for those of you who want to become certified? Okay, I will, this is from a participant, Grace Chan. Grace, remind me of this question, because I'm going to talk about this a little bit, but I think I might be talking about it in my second talk, but remind me, so table that. The answer to that question is really quickly, and I'll talk about it more later. There's no national certification, but there are other more specific local certifications you can obtain. It's a good question, but we can go back to it. Again, this should be basic info for most folks who have been trained as speech language pathologists or audiologists, where we see dialectal variation across all domains of language, right? We see it in phonology, we see it in syntax, so on and so forth. And it doesn't matter if you're a monolingual speaker of whatever, or if you're a dual language learner and you speak English and whatever else, you can exhibit dialectal variation, right? And it can be extremely variable. And so I'm going to give you some examples, at least from Spanish speakers in the United States, right? So a very clear one is in Spanish, at least in the United States, is do folks tend to speak, and these are kind of major dialectal families, which is do you speak an inland dialect of Spanish or a coastal dialect of Spanish, right? Inland speakers tend to pronounce final consonants, coastal dialect speakers tend not to, right? So I'm actually originally from Mexico City, so I'm kind of, and I'm considered kind of an inland speaker. So this word means houses, right? So I would say casas, I would pronounce that final consonant, where let's say a speaker potentially from, let's say, Cuba or Puerto Rico, they probably would say casa, right? There are arguments that people say, is it really deletion or is it aspiration? We don't need to get into that. The idea is that it's very clearly a different, like that final consonant, it's quite different, right? And then lexicon, these are different words that mean the color brown, right? So café, marrón, brown, they all means the same thing, right? It's the same color. Morphosyntactic variations can sometimes be in terms of ordering of words, right? So this first one, which means like dad come over, right? This is something I would say papá ven, right? But someone, let's say from like Argentina might say vení papá, right? It means exactly the same thing, right? It's just ordered a little different. And again, the important part is that these variations are not errors, and we need to be really aware of that, right? When we test, let's say, like a Spanish-speaking kid, because if you're testing speech sound production, and you might mark this as an error, right? But you need to be aware, what dialect does this kid speak, right? Is this an inland speaker of Spanish? If so, then you probably would say, yeah, that's an error. But if it's a coastal speaker of Spanish, you want to be aware that this is part of their phonological dialectal patterns, right? Same thing if you were doing like a picture naming task and you're like, what color is this, right? And maybe your word is café, but the kid says marrón, you might be like, oh, what's that? That's wrong. But it's not wrong, right? So this is why we need to be aware and why it's important to be aware of these variations, right? So due to this, right? So as we think about bilingual assessment, we think, oh, well, it's English, and then there's this other language. And yes, that's true. But we also, I want you all to be aware of these other variations because it makes the picture a little bit more complex, and it does need to be taken into account whenever possible. Other things you need to think about is obviously what is the relationship of quote unquote the home language or native language relative to the second language, which in the US it tends to obviously be English. And that can be in terms of educational history, that can be in terms of who lives at home, who's speaking what to whom. And just be aware, right? These other variations, they can exist, you know, in the native language, but also in the second language as well. Okay, let's talk about just bilingualism as a core concept, right? We know that the United States is a little bit weird in this sense because most of the world is quote unquote bilingual or multilingual, right? And there are multiple types of bilingual or classifications of quote unquote what's bilingual. So we'll try to define what that is, right? And finally, we'll try to address this question, which is, are dual language learners essentially two monolinguals in one person, right? Okay, I won't spend too much time on this, but I just kind of want you to see different terms that you might encounter, right? I think the one that a lot of us have seen in the literature when we have been instructed is this simultaneous versus sequential, which means, is this a bilingual kid or a dual language learner who grew up hearing and being exposed to two languages from birth, or did they start learning English later in time, right? And a lot of times there's a differentiation as like when, right? If you learned it at 3 years or older, you're sequential, and if before, you're simultaneous. So that's kind of one really common one, but then there's a couple of other ones that I think are interesting, right? This one I think is important, this receptive bilingual people to be aware of. These are folks who, sometimes you'll meet folks that will say, well, my parents like spoke, let's say, Cantonese, and I don't really speak Cantonese, but I can kind of understand, I can understand the basics of it. So if someone's talking in Cantonese, like if my grandma's talking to me in Cantonese, I kind of understand what she's trying to say, but I have to talk back to her in English, right? This is kind of what we would know as a receptive bilingual, where the expressive skills are pretty suppressed, but the receptive skills are maintained to some degree, right? And there's a few other ones like elective bilingual. These are folks who choose to learn another language for a particular reason, right? Maybe I'm going to tell myself, hey, maybe next year I'll be really comfortable and travel internationally again, and maybe I want to go to Italy. So between now and next summer, I'm going to learn I'm going to take classes. I'm going to learn Italian because I want to be able to speak in Italian, right? That would be me being an elective bilingual. So you have the option, right? Where we have to remember in the United States, for a lot of kids, they don't fall in this category, right? They're kind of forced to become speakers of English. And that is important in terms of sometimes the challenges that we see. So let's try to define bilingualism. So instead of it being like either you're fully bilingual or not, I think this is a really nice definition. It's pretty old, but I think it's a great definition, right? Which is this, it's a very relative condition in terms of that you can be slightly or very bilingual. And then this is another nice definition that I like from Conert, which is really more in terms of your functional need or desire to be bilingual, right? And the thing is that can change over time, right? Maybe you used to be bilingual, but you're not anymore, right? Or maybe you currently are, or maybe 5 years from now, you might get a job in a country that requires you to be bilingual, or you might be doing virtual work where you have to communicate with folks not in English, right? So this part here is just to kind of get an idea of what if we had to kind of draw it out, right? What would it look like, right? So if you imagine A to be one language, and you imagine the big A to be like full proficiency and the little a to be limited proficiency, right? We really kind of, those of us who sort of call ourselves bilingual, we live somewhere in this continuum, right? These are ambilingual folks or perfectly balanced bilingual folks. I would say the majority of bilingual folks are not here. They do exist, but the majority, we fall somewhere around here, right? Our proficiency tends to be a little bit different in each language. But it's a little more complex, right? That one by this sort of drew out. This is a really nice illustration from Peña and colleagues, where they're taking kind of that continuum and they're really kind of plotting it, right? And if we were to imagine, this is not real data, this is just fictional data to kind of drive the point, right? These could be like performance on maybe both languages, right? And so if you look at this kind of plot of data, we could sort of say, well, the kids who are falling kind of on this quadrant, right? They're kind of high, and we could say high English, high Spanish, just as an example. And then you're going to have kids who fall in these quadrants, which are going to be high and low in something, right? So maybe if we think of B as English and A as Spanish, this would be high English, low Spanish performing kids, low English, high Spanish. And then you're gonna have kids in this quadrant, right, which are kind of the low kids. And sometimes you might say, well, all of these kids then probably have language impairments. Well, I think we want to focus on this quadrant for clinical services, but what we really want to focus on are the kids who are definitely quite low in both areas, right? Because a lot of times you'll test kids who are kind of like around here, and then you really got to sort of tell yourself, is that actually a language impairment, or is that just low normal performance, right? And I think we really need to focus on the kids who are definitely, you know, let's say like 1 or 1.5 standard deviations below the mean on whatever you might be testing them on. And then finally, thinking of that continuum, we do have to remember that there's multiple domains of language, right? Here's something like a sort of, I don't have pragmatics on here, but we could do that. So if we think just like vocabulary, grammar, and phonology, right? This could be, you could test a kid and the kid might demonstrate this profile, where their vocabulary might be pretty good in both languages, but their grammar definitely is stronger and weaker in the other language, and their phonology too. And then this could be another kid, and that could be another kid. This could also be the same kid over time, right? Over time, sometimes this bilingual sort of, these profiles tend to change also over time. That was my dog, sorry about that. So anyway, so what do we know about dual language learning? I think this is kind of really important, right? Just in general, again, kind of more background information. Just whether you're monolingual or bilingual, right? We know that as long as, you know, you're essentially gone through like full term and you have this intact system, right? We have evidence that infants, like even fetuses, can learn from any input, right? And that system refers to a basic development of multiple subsystems. So we could think sensory, perceptual, cognitive, and a really important part is that early learning has been shown to really kind of shape the mechanisms that we use for future learning, again, just across all individuals, regardless of the languages they speak. Now, there are some folks that focus really on working with sometimes kids who haven't been born yet, or very young babies who have just been born, which is focusing on this kind of issue of quote native language, right? And we have evidence that kids are really good at discriminating sounds from any language, right? And this is the argument that really our quote unquote our neurological development is really wired for learning multiple languages, learning any of the languages that are spoken anywhere in the world, right? But over time, that capacity, right, to process like the phonology from any language and to realize for these infants to demonstrate through different methods that, hey, this particular phonology is different from this particular phonology, that ability starts narrowing, right? Or it starts becoming more focused on your native language rather quickly, right? So at around 6 months, infants kind of really begin to focus on these native language only sounds. And so if you start playing them like sounds from another language, they probably won't be able to process them as well. And kids who are growing up in bilingual environments tend to be able to maintain this for a little bit longer, this ability. A lot of us have seen, sometimes in the empirical literature, but also now in more kind of mainstream literature, this issue of the cognitive processing advantage, right? And a lot of that's kind of really focused on kids who are bilingual. And actually, a lot of this work, just so that you know, tends to be based on adults. Not entirely, but a lot of it tends to be based on adults, or sometimes young adults. So they seem to demonstrate greater cognitive control. Sometimes it means that they're better able to sort of ignore distracting information, and also just more consistent inhibition. But I think one of the things that's really true about this literature is that a lot of that's dependent on how much experience they have in each language, right? So folks who have a lifetime of being bilingual and who professionally are using both languages at work tend to demonstrate much higher processing efficiency in both languages. And when we see differences in those experiences in those languages, we tend to see differences in processing efficiency, right? So we believe that a lot of these differences are driven by just like the properties of input, right? Between these differences that monolinguals experience versus dual language learners, right? So even though we might have all these systems intact at birth, we know that they're not mature systems. And again, these early mechanisms are going to affect our future learning. And importantly, with language development, we always have to remember that another piece that plays into this is where these kids are being exposed to language, right? What's happening at home, what's happening outside of the home. So, all of these pieces, whether you're talking about bilingual or monolingual folks, a lot of it has to do with input, right? And a lot of times people focus on quantity of input. I think both are important, both quality and quantity. And another thing that I think is really important is what are the opportunities that really, let's say like the infant or the toddler has for output, right? That's really important as well. And a lot of these differences that we tend to see between monolinguals and dual language learners are really, I think, kind of couched in the sense that, dual language learners are being exposed to a different set of conditions and communication demands than monolinguals are, just because probably their home language or languages might be a little different than what they're being exposed to, let's say, at preschool, right? Okay, another piece that I think is important to talk about is code switching. A lot of us have heard of code switching, so I was do code switching. And this is just really simple examples, right? So if we're going to do Spanish and English, like a kid might say, el frog se metió al hole, or the rana went into the hoyo, right? That's all code switching. A lot of folks have studied code switching. We know that it's not really indicative of any kind of disorder. This is just something normal that bilingual folks tend to do, especially when they're speaking to another listener who's also bilingual, right? And that can vary by, again, context, community, language ability, and not by language ability, sorry. And one of the things interesting, again, just to remember about code switching, is that code switching really follows like the grammatical patterns or the morphosyntax of both. It respects the morphosyntaxes of both languages simultaneously, right? Another piece that's important is, there's a lot of information on this slide. I won't necessarily talk about every single point, but it's this issue that skills in one language transfer to another language, and we have lots of evidence for that. We have seen it in terms of, for example, phonological awareness. Kids with higher phonological awareness tend to then show faster growth in syntax. We have also seen it in terms of kids' ability to tell stories, right? Especially retell stories. The early skills in that tend to predict their reading skills later in time, right? Both, within and across languages. And, there are folks who then have focused now more specifically on kids who are bilingual, who have disorders, right? And some of them can be your garden variety, let's say speech sound disorders or language impairment, quote unquote DLD, or kids with hearing impairments. But we have also seen it in populations where the impairment in language is not the primary impairment, but there's another primary impairment, and kids can still develop bilingually, right? So here's some examples. Here's some folks that are doing work in this area, and there are obviously other areas of disorder. So to answer that question about whether DLLs are two monolinguals in one, the answer is no, right? The two languages of these kids are going to differ from the language of monolingual kids in either language. I think it's really influenced by different factors. And it's very important to remember that the language skills of DLLs are really distributed. They're distributed differently across languages. That's typically how they are. Very rarely is it equal. So these are, again, just general properties of language acquisition that we tend to assume to be the case, right? That it's very robust, that it happens fast, that it doesn't have to be explicitly taught. And all of that's true for dual language learners, but there's some assumptions for that to be true, right? One is that the system's intact. The other one is the kids having this equal support and opportunities to use both languages, which isn't always the case, and that they're being exposed to a very rich linguistic environment, which is not always the case. So the question in terms of dual language development is the social linguistic context is really important. And we also just have to be aware that in the US, there's a very clear differentiation between the majority status language, which is English, and anything else is considered a minority status language. And kids are very well aware of this. And you'll see that when you work with kids in your caseloads. Okay, really quickly, I want to do a quick show and tell just so that we kind of hear maybe what a kid sounds like over time in their ability to retell stories. And then we're also going to see how DLLs can grow in terms of just processing skills. And you're going to see a video of a kid who's doing a self-regulation task where the kid has to do the opposite of what the examiner is doing, and you'll get to see in the video. But first, let's start with just listening, right? So let's start with student A. We're going to hear a couple of little audio clips when the child was 4 years, 9 months old, 5 years, 3 months old, and 6 years, 3 months old, right? And the kid's retelling these frog stories that many of you are aware of. So we'll start with their English.
And then?
Okay.
Y luego?
At the same age, but in Spanish.
Mhm.
Okay. That's a semester later,
The little frog.
and then a year later.
And then?
And then the little frog hopped and landed on the bed.
Okay, so folks are saying that the clip is very, I'm going to turn my volume up and see if that helps with folks. And I would recommend people to also turn up the volume on your end, but maybe this will help.
Se cayó de la música. Ganó la torre.
Okay, so for those, hopefully some folks were able to hear this. I'm going to kind of give you a quick hint because I'm going to ask you a really quick question, which is I'm going to show you, these are going to be, you're going to hear two students. This is student A, now you're going to hear student B. One of these students is demonstrating English growth, but also demonstrating deceleration or loss of their Spanish over time. And another one of these students is going to be showing dual language growth. They're going to be showing growth in their English and growth in their Spanish. So once you listen to student B, if people want to comment on the chat, let's see which student you think was demonstrating loss of their Spanish versus which student was showing dual language growth.
And then?
Okay, so here's student B.
In English?
Yeah.
Okay.
One day, you one frog, you one, you one.
It's pretty clear, right? For one, this child is using intonation in English, but this child is essentially not using real words in English, right? The kid's kind of like faking their English.
Se encontró un niño jugando en el parque con su barco.
But in Spanish, those of you who speak and understand Spanish, this kid's clearly talking in Spanish at 4 years, 1 month old. So about half a year later.
The duck and the frog and the dog and the boy were sleeping. The frog jumped out of the window of the frog window, and then when the dog and the
Okay, so that was kind of at the end of this period, around 5.5 years old. Now let's go back and look at half a year later in Spanish.
bebé luego y luego el gato se despertó y luego lloró el bebé luego.
And then again, about 6 months later, actually about a year later.
Un ensalada y luego cuando empezó a comer la rana salió. Ew. Y de-
Okay, so really quickly, and people can comment on the chat, which of these students do you feel, either A or B, which one of them do you feel demonstrated English growth, but loss of their Spanish? See if people, yeah, so hopefully it was clear. Yes, A demonstrated clear English growth, but also clear loss of their Spanish, right? Their their speaking rate decreased, but also their pausing increased, even their volume went a little bit down, and they were just a lot less fluent in Spanish, right? And B, I think very clearly demonstrated a tremendous amount of growth in their English, especially, right? Because at 4.1, again, the child is just really not using real words, but is using English intonation. But by a year and a half later, the kid is retelling this narrative with quite a high degree of skill, right? In Spanish, the kid only also got better. So again, just showing kind of this variability and heterogeneity in terms of how kids' dual language development can change over time, right? And then finally, we just talked about this is what we saw. And then I'm going to show you a video right before wrapping up. And this is the child when the child was 4.5, and then when the child was 6 years old. And this is a child who's performing what we call, it's a self-regulation test called head, toes, knees, shoulders. And the idea is the examiner is doing something like, for example, the examiner might say, when I say touch your head, you touch your toes, right? So the examiner gives instructions and then actually does the task. And the idea here is that you, as a participant, have to use different skills of self-regulation, right? You need to use especially like inhibition to be able to not copy what someone else is doing, right? And then you also have to remember what you have to do, which is quote unquote the opposite, right? And there's like head, and then there's shoulders, and there's knees, and there's toes. So let's first look at how this child is doing this task. And you can do this task obviously in both languages, right? So let's see what's happening with this kid at 4.5.
What do you do if I say touch your shoulders? Good job, you touch your knees. Okay, let's practice a few more. Touch your knees. Remember, in this game, when I say touch your knees, you touch your shoulders. Touch your shoulders.
Okay, so this is the instructional part, and the kid's clearly like having some difficulty right at 4.5. Let's see what happens at about a year and a half later.
Tócate los dedos del pie. Tócate la cabeza. Tócate la cabeza. Tócate los dedos del pie. Tócate la cabeza.
So this is a child who showed the ability to get better and better at doing this task over time, and the kid was able to do it better and better in both languages. Now, we also have data from kids who they get better and better usually in English, but sometimes they don't get sometimes it's even almost kind of like their receptive understanding what they're supposed to do in Spanish sometimes starts suffering a little bit over time, especially depending on what type of instructional program they're enrolled in, right? So, a lot of times we will work with parents, and many parents sometimes want to ask us as the clinicians what they're supposed to do. And they're saying, you're telling me all these things about bilingual language development and you're encouraging things, but in school, my kids have to learn English. So what are we supposed to do? So one of the key parent recommendations that I think is important to always remind parents of, and sometimes parents are just not aware of this, and when you tell them, sometimes it makes a lot of sense to them, which is it's important for parents to use the language or the languages that they're just comfortable speaking in, right? Sometimes parents will be told, well, you need to speak in English to your child at home. But if the parent does not feel comfortable speaking English or their English is limited, they're going to be giving this child a really poor quality language model, right? So just do what's natural, basically, at home. Don't try to speak in a language or languages that you're not comfortable speaking in. That's not going to have the right sort of outcome that you're hoping for. Another thing that I think is important is it's really important to have kids, if they speak a language other than English at home, for them to interact with family members who also speak that language, but also to interact with peers who speak that language. And sometimes, yes, that can be your cousins and so forth, but that can also be a play group that might meet in the park, or there might be library-based play groups. I think having interactions with same age peers is really important, and being able to do that in different languages, right? And for parents to, as possible, because not all parents have the ability to do this, but whenever possible, try to become as engaged as you can in your child's education. What that means is get to know the teacher, right? If the teacher maybe only speaks English and the parent only speaks, let's say, Spanish, or only speaks Gujarati, or whatever the case might be, try to get an interpreter, right? So that you develop a relationship with your child's teacher. Try to be able to assist with homework. Again, if homework is in English, you don't read English, try to do what's possible to send a translation home, even if it's not exactly the same assignment, but just to learn the same skills, right? So you can help your child at home. And then school activities, school fairs, field trips, try to get involved as much as possible. And not all parents can do this because some parents have to work all the time. So, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to say like, hey, you need to demonstrate to your child that their education is really important and that you're as involved as you can be. And again, finally, if someone's not comfortable either in English, either in a meeting or getting paperwork in English, in a public school, parents have the right by federal law to request information in their language and to have an interpreter there who can help them interact with school staff. And a lot of parents don't know this, and sometimes in the different school districts, sometimes some administrators don't know this, but it's definitely part of IDEA, right? The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? That's something, that's a right that's afforded to parents by the Department of Education, which overrides any kind of state mandates that someone might say, well, we're not going to do it. Well, you have to by law, right? Okay, that wraps up this keynote with basic concepts. This is taken before the pandemic, but this is a picture of some of the folks in my lab. We're having like a big party, which we haven't been able to do, but hopefully in the near future. Thank you so much. And question for participant: can we get a copy of the sources cited, especially this chapter? So I definitely send some literature to Lisa. The book I can't send because it's actually a book in print and there's not an e-version as far as I'm aware. It was just published. But what I'll do is I'll send just a list of references so you can actually look up the book. Yes, I can share the title. I can look it up real quick. I'll go ahead and stop sharing just so y'all can see me. Yes, I can tell you the title of the book really quickly. I'm just gonna look at my folder of publications here. Disability chapter. Yes, here it is. Documents. Okay. So the book, I'm gonna on the chat, I'm gonna put in the name of the book. So this is the book title. And it is the 4th edition. Authors of the book are Paul and Aaron Simmons. And then the chapter itself is chapter 10. So within that book is chapter 10. And what I'll do is I can send like an actual list of references, which actually will be more helpful than me trying to do this on chat. But anyway, I think we might be close to being out of time, but if there's any questions, please feel free to ask while we're kind of in this transition point.
Question?
Okay, if parents are
bilingual in English. Go ahead, Dr. Rojas. Maybe repeat the question so that our interpreters can interpret that.
The question is, if parents are bilingual, English is very good, do you recommend that they speak only English at home if the child is struggling with language development? It's a really good question. I don't know if part of where this question is coming from is there is this notion called like one parent, one language. And there's some proponents for that sort of approach. I'll use my brother as an example, my older brother. You know, we both grew up speaking only Spanish. Our parents don't speak English, but his wife is from England, so his wife speaks English, and then he speaks Spanish, and they met in England. But his wife also speaks Spanish. His wife's English is much better than her Spanish, and my brother's pretty. I mean, he's not totally balanced, but close to it. So both of their English is really good. And when he had his first child, he asked me about this, and he was like, so I really want my kid to be able to speak both languages. So I think I'm only going to speak to him in Spanish, and my wife is only going to speak to him in English, so that, you know, he's hearing Spanish all the time. And the only issue with that approach, whether a kid's typically developing or has language impairment, is that parents can't do that as consistently as they think they can, because when the parents talk to each other, they're going to talk in one language or another, right? When someone comes to visit, they're going to talk in some language or another. When, you know, if the kid goes to the grocery store with the parents, they're going to talk in some language or another to the cashier, right? So yeah, if the English is very good, you recommend that they only speak English at home. My answer to that question would be like, if at home they tend to speak only in English, sure. But if at home they tend to speak maybe primarily English, but they speak some, I don't know, whatever it is, some Italian, or they speak some Vietnamese, then do that at home, even if the child has a language impairment. So hopefully that helps to answer that question. So I wouldn't say by default you would say only speak English at home, unless that's what the parents have been doing anyway before they had their kid, right? If that's what they're used to doing, then yeah, keep doing it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rojas.